We're talking about schizophrenia. The prevalence rate for schizophrenia around the world is about 1 out of every 100 people suffers from schizophrenia, or they will suffer from schizophrenia during their lifetime. It's estimated that about 2.5 million Americans have schizophrenia. Most of these individuals are not institutionalized. They're living at home. As long as they're medicated, usually they're okay. Sufferers have an increased risk of suicide and of physical, often fatal illnesses, and the reason they have fatal illnesses is because they're immunocompromised. And they will stay immunocompromised for the rest of their lives. And since they're immunocompromised, any disease that comes along, they will catch. So if you've got, normally these individuals, if they don't die from their own hand, usually they'll die from pneumonia. And the reason they die from pneumonia is because it's difficult for them to fight off any infections at all. People suffering from schizophrenia tend and commit suicide at a relatively high rate. And the reason is because their thinking is not the thinking of reality. And since it's not the thinking of reality, a lot of times, since they can't communicate with anybody, their reality is totally different from everybody else's. Since they can't, it's really disturbing to them. And a lot of times they end up trying to kill themselves, unfortunately. Even if they're on their medication. People that are on their medication that are not having a psychotic episode, their sense of reality is still skewed. And for that reason, of course, now we have a relatively serious problem that we have to deal with. Schizophrenia appears in all socioeconomic groups, but it is found more frequently in lower socioeconomic groups, and that's probably because of genes. Individuals, there is a genetic aspect to it, so the probability of a family that has schizophrenia in the family being wealthy is fairly remote, or even being middle class is fairly remote, because if you're schizophrenic, you cannot work. Once upon a long time ago, and it wasn't that long ago, I guess, maybe 60, 70 years, there was no disability. And since there was no disability, this individual suffering from schizophrenia had no way of taking care of themselves. And that's one of the reasons why we had so many people suffering from schizophrenia in mental hospitals. And then there was a president that decided that we would do away with the mental hospitals. Does anybody know who that president was? Reagan. Yeah, General Ronald Reagan. That sounds so mean to me. I know, let's close all the mental hospitals. What are we going to do with all these guys? I know, we'll just put them out, let them go, and let them be free and go out and with themselves out on the street. Yeah, they're real lucid. They can certainly find food. And the answer was, of course, that's when they started opening all the soup kitchens and whatnot. So just about every little town has some place where these people can go, unfortunately, because Ronald Reagan closed the hospitals. So what happened to all those hospitals? Nothing. Nothing happened with all those hospitals. Anyway, so these individuals tend to be of a lower socioeconomic status, and they do tend to lose their jobs and not be able to take care of themselves. And this is known as the downward drift theory of schizophrenia. Now, if you were a wealthy person in the United States, you like to pretend that this doesn't exist, but the reality is it does exist, and there's nothing we can do. There is something we could do about it, but it costs money. And if you're wealthy, you don't want to spend your money. That sounds so stupid to me. If I've got more money, don't I want to help people with my money? No, I want to make more money. So I want to keep as much as I possibly can. Doesn't this not make any sense whatsoever? Shouldn't you want to help people with your money? That's not the way it works. So the more money you have, so then you try to elect a president that will give you a bigger tax break so that you pay less money than everybody else. Since you have more, now you get to keep more. I think that's a pretty good deal. Because you want more, exactly. Middle class people, they don't really want that much more money. I mean, I'm going to get a raise. I get a raise at the end of this year. I'm so excited. It's like $2,000. Spread that out over a month. What is that? Like 15 cents an hour or something? I know I get a raise of 15 cents. I'm so excited. I'm excited, but I'm not rich. I'm not wealthy. But if I was wealthy, I would want as much money as I could possibly get. It's just the way it works. I know it doesn't make any sense to me either. Anyway, downward shift theory. I'm not trying to tell you how to vote. You vote for anybody you want. But you're going to be electing 2 new senators, I have a feeling. I don't think John King's going to run. He's got glioblastoma. I don't think he's going to run. Even though I'd love to see him in Congress, because the guy's, he kicks butt, doesn't he? I mean, he does. Like, he doesn't care what everybody tells him to do. He just does what he thinks is right. How many people do we have in Congress that do what they think is right? And they go against their party. He went against his party. And boy, I'll tell you what, Trump is still blasting him for voting down or not voting down Obamacare. That's too funny. So you guys are going to get to vote. And you need to vote. You need to decide who's going to be your next 2 senators from Arizona. And you need to vote in people that will help you. Okay? Don't look at me. I live in Iowa. I vote in Iowa, so I don't get to vote. But you guys get to vote. So what you need to do is decide who are the best people for you, and get everybody to vote for those people. That's what you need to do. That's what they did up in Montana. Up in Montana, the crazy right-wing idiots, they kept electing those individuals, and the Indians got together and they said, these are white supremacists. We don't want those assholes to be our representatives anymore. And they only represent 6% of the population, and they're the ones that changed it. So now they've got 2 Democratic senators and actually they have a Republican representative, but they had 2 Democratic senators from more liberal senators that actually care about the Indians up there. And they did it. The people up there didn't vote because, they didn't care. So the Indians didn't care up there. Now they do. And now they've changed things. You guys can change things too. You represent a relatively large percentage of the population in this state. And it could be your vote that changes things. So I'm just trying to do what the hell you want to do. I don't care. I live in Iowa. What do I care what's happening here? Okay. But they really changed things up in Montana. And I'm really proud of those guys. Because things changed when I was up there. Not that I had anything to do with it. But things changed. My friends changed things up there because they got together. And they took people to the polls. They didn't tell them how to vote, but they just told them that they needed to vote. So follow Sheldon. Elect Sheldon for senator. There we go. Equal numbers of men suffer from it as women, though the disorder seems to be more severe and begin earlier for men. This is really kind of interesting. So despite why would women not suffer from schizophrenia? Is there any rationale to that? I know there's something wrong with men. Why? Can you think of any reason? Remember I told you that women have a larger corpus callosum, and for that reason they're able to regulate things a little bit better in their brains? No offense to men, or offense to men, I don't know. They're sitting in the back. Chris is over here. He doesn't care. So women are able to, if they have a problem, they're able to alleviate that problem more readily than men are because of their larger corpus callosum. They have more communication going on between their left and right hemispheres. Almost 3% of all those who are divorced or separated suffer from schizophrenia sometime during their lives, compared with 1% of married people and 2% of people who remain single. And of course, who wants to marry this crazy guy is the question. One of the things we know about mental illness, if we have an individual that's depressed, guess who they marry?
Someone opposite?
I'm sorry?
Someone similar?
Someone similar, exactly. So if we have a schizophrenic person, guess who they marry?
Same personality.
Someone with exactly the same personality. Same way with hyper-anxiety. OCD people marry each other. It's I know, it's a little strange. But, I mean, who understands you better than somebody else who's bipolar, right? Yeah, exactly. So that's what I'm looking for. That's what I was looking for in a wife. I was looking for somebody like me. And if you've ever met my wife, she's, how she puts up with me. Doris is sitting there. Doris knows my wife, so she's...
I thought men married their moms.
Oh, man. My mother used to kick my butt all the time.
They
So,
find ladies that are similar. Actually, some men.
there you go. I think I married my wife the first time I got married. But this wife isn't my mother.
Men married for attraction.
Oh, women do too.
Is it really?
Oh, yes, you do. Did you see the smile on her face? She knows she did. She does. That's exactly what women do. You're looking for the hottest guy. That's why Sheldon had such a hard time getting married. I know. Women are so picky. Why are they so picky? I don't know. I found 3 women that would marry me. All of them wore glasses. You take their glasses off, they think I'm not bad looking. Anyway, 2.1% of African Americans receive the diagnosis of schizophrenia, while whites only receive the diagnosis in 1.4% of the population. When I was living in Mississippi, it was really kind of curious. They had 2 mental hospitals. This is back in 1995. They had 2 mental hospitals in the state. One of them was for white people, one of them was for black people. I know we're not supposed to do that, but this is Mississippi, okay? Anyway, the mental hospital for black people, they diagnosed people with schizophrenia all the time. The people that were there, they diagnosed them with schizophrenia, so they treated them for schizophrenia, and they got better. The mental hospital for white people, they diagnosed them with bipolar disorder. Now you can't, if you give somebody the medication for bipolar disorder and they have schizophrenia, it's not going to work. Okay. So they had a lot more people in there because of the fact that they were mistreated, because they wouldn't diagnose them with schizophrenia. In Mississippi, they felt that schizophrenia was a diagnosis for African Americans, except that's not the term that they used. We won't go into what term they actually did use, but if you asked anybody, and this may be one of the reasons why there are so few white people, because they just don't diagnose them with the more severe psychosis. Schizophrenia requires 2, and I'm saying, I saw this in Mississippi. I haven't seen that any other place, but in Mississippi it was quite prevalent. And the white people were starting to get kind of pissed off because they were misdiagnosing them. And you know, that's Mississippi for you. But that was just Mississippi. Schizophrenia requires 2 psychotic symptoms during a 1-month active phase. Normally, if they have a psychotic episode, it usually only lasts for a month. One of the things I need you to remember is that the human brain tries to fix itself whenever there's a problem. So if you're depressed, it tries not to be depressed. If you have anxiety, you try not to be anxious. If you have schizophrenia, it tries to fix itself. So you rarely will see a psychotic episode that lasts longer than a month. And all of this makes a lot of sense. So we very rarely will see somebody in crisis for an extended length of time. Depression may last for 6 months, but of course at the same time the brain is upregulating the serotonin receptors so that it will be more sensitive to serotonin, more sensitive to norepinephrine. So potentially, if it can find enough serotonin or norepinephrine, it will start feeling better. So the human brain wants to be fixed. And this is the reason why the psychotic episodes don't last forever. You never see somebody with a psychotic episode that lasts for longer than a month, because the human brain can't handle it. It will try to fix itself. It will do anything that it can to fix itself. So there are outside things that you can do to make yourself feel better. Okay, so let's say that there is a theory out there that schizophrenia is caused by too many dopamine receptor sites. So you're getting information So since you have all these receptor sites, you're getting information that doesn't actually exist because you've got all these receptor sites, and they're looking for information. If they can't find anything, then they hallucinate or they have delusions. Okay. So you've got all these dopamine receptor sites. So what, if you've ever been around people that are schizophrenic, what do they do to help to fix themselves? And this is something that they do by themselves. I'm sorry?
They talk to themselves?
They do talk to themselves, but it's not going to raise the dopamine level. I'm sorry? You're thinking migraines. That would work. When I get in the dark, I get scared.
I think they keep quiet and don't want to socialize.
They don't socialize, yeah, because it will increase their psychosis, potentially, because it will irritate them. It will aggravate them. So you are right, but that's not the one thing that they do. The one thing that they do that has to do with dopamine, I'm sorry, should have been a rhetorical question. I should have really asked you. The one thing that they do is smoke cigarettes. Why? Because when you smoke cigarettes, you get a dopamine spike, and that occupies those dopamine receptor sites. So if you've ever been around schizophrenics, it's so freaky because these guys will chain smoke. Every damn single one of them chain smokes. They will smoke one cigarette after another. It's the only way they can feel normal. Yeah. So it's self-medication. It's not funny. It's not really that funny. But at the same time, they're trying to fix themselves. And that's really important. The fact that we do things to fix ourselves. So one of the interesting things about alcohol, we see more people that are depressed who drink alcohol. Now the question you have to ask yourself is, if I overdrink alcohol, is it because I'm depressed? But of course, people don't ask themselves that question. It's self-medication. And we do this all the time. We will do whatever it is to make ourselves feel normal. And we do it with exercise. So if you've got somebody that's kind of depressed, especially if it's a male, he can raise his testosterone level just by exercising. He can also raise his testosterone level by punching the wall or by punching his significant other. No, this is really important. So there's a lot of things that is taking place, that potentially is taking place, that has to do with self-medication. And that's one of the things that we have to think about. So if we are talking to somebody that has a mental illness, we should be listening to them and trying to figure out how many cigarettes do they smoke. Are they drinking too much sugar? Are they trying to raise their energy level? Are they doing something physical to raise their testosterone if they're a male? Are they eating fatty foods if they're a female? Females don't have as much testosterone, so exercise doesn't work as well for you, but fat doesn't work as well for males. So if it's a female, is she eating more fat that she needs? Is she eating ice cream for supper every night? That's one of the things you have to ask yourself. How much fat is she consuming? Is she eating pizza? Cheese has a lot of tryptophan. Tryptophan is a precursor for serotonin. Serotonin will actually make you feel better. Does all that make sense? Okay, so we have a schizophrenic individual, and how are they trying to fix themselves? By smoking. They smoke tobacco. Raises their dopamine. It increases their dopamine level in their brain. And so when they're feeling psychotic, if they are feeling psychotic, they'll smoke a cigarette. And that will make them feel less psychotic. So can we treat them with tobacco? No, here, take this cancer stick. I want you to smoke like 40 or 50 of these a day. You'll feel better about your schizophrenia, but you're going to die of cancer in about 5 years. That always works. I'm just kidding. We wouldn't do that. All right. In early versions of the DSM, the diagnosis could be given with only one active psychotic symptom if either bizarre delusions or auditory hallucinations were present. Now the problem was defining what is bizarre. So if something is bizarre to you, maybe it's not bizarre to me. Maybe it's perfectly normal. Anyway, this was the problem. We couldn't define what bizarre was. So in the DSM-5, they took that part out because we couldn't define what bizarre was. Schizophrenia involves either a decline from a prior level or function or a failure to meet expected levels. This is usually apparent to others who know the person. So if you know this person, this is really kind of interesting. If you have a set of twins, and one of the twins is going to develop schizophrenia, if you look at films of those twins when they were babies, you can tell which one is going to develop schizophrenia. As parents, we overlook these things. As parents, we don't want to know. So if somebody hides when you try to take their picture, if somebody never smiles, do we notice that they're not smiling as their parents? No, we try to rationalize it, unfortunately. But if somebody else looks at that film, they say, well, that kid's acting weird. Well, that kid's still acting weird. Well, the one that's acting weird, is that the same one that was acting weird before? We can tell. And the strange part is, as a psychologist, I'm probably the worst one to do it. It's somebody it's a layperson who's not a psychologist, who will see the oddity in that individual. I will try to rationalize it just like the parents will. So I'm not very good at it. But you would be well, you guys are all becoming psychologists, so we're skewing you just as badly as I'm skewed. But the reality is that anybody can see this. So we can see this type of behavior. We can we as lay people can identify. Now the interesting thing is, it's not just schizophrenia. We can see if somebody is going to be gay. Or gaydar, it's what they used to call gaydar. Gaydar is actually fairly accurate. People that aren't gay are better at it than people who are gay, as it turns out. And they did a study in Finland looking at people identifying individuals as being gay or not gay. And they were able to do that. Individuals who were not professionals. And the professionals were worse. They were bad at it. But the individuals that weren't professionals were able to identify them. As interesting as that is. Signs of the disorder must persist for at least 6 months. Yes, ma'am?
So how old or how young can you tell, like the person, like, how old, how young, you just, oh really?
I know. Okay, here's, the reality is, I mean, we've just done the study, Don keeps telling me.
Babies?
Yeah.
That's young as babies.
As young as babies. We can tell that there's a problem. Don keeps talking about this. We did a study, we did research a number of years ago, and they just came out with the research like 6 months, over the last 6 months. What they discovered is that the gene that causes schizophrenia, on that same gene is also autism, depression, bipolar disorder, and ADHD. Okay, it's all on the same gene, as curious as that is. So if you have somebody that's autistic, you know it as a baby. You know that the child is autistic. But if somebody will have schizophrenia in the future, they also pull away from their caregiver. So you can see that as a baby. I have a niece that is schizophrenic. She suffers from schizophrenia. They tried not to diagnose her with schizophrenia, but they couldn't help it. Initially, they diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder. Then they diagnosed her with bipolar disorder, and finally they decided it was schizophrenia. I knew that there was something wrong with this kid when she was a baby. I couldn't tell her mother. Her mother's a piece of it, okay? But and I told this lady, you need another kid because there's something wrong with this kid. I wanted her to have another child so that maybe she would start acting normal with a normal child. But this kid never smiled as a baby. She always had that look on her face like she was about to cry. If you gave her something, she, instead of smiling, she had that look like, I don't know whether to be happy or sad. I mean, from the earliest years, you could see this. She never smiled as a baby. Babies smile when they fart. If anything comes out that way, it makes them smile. And it still makes people smile when they fart. But not her. she could load her diaper up with that strange look where she's not sure whether she should laugh or cry. It looked like she was right on the verge of crying. And my mother talked about it. My mother complained. My mother was a nurse, and she worked in the nursery a lot. And so she knew that there was something going on with this. And I knew that there was something going on with this with the mother, of course. Last one to know. Unfortunately. Yeah, so you can tell it almost right away. And if you take movies of these individuals, you can watch the movies, and anybody can identify this person as this was not correct. She was the same age, my niece is the same age as my son. And my son used to play with her all the time. And he said, and she made stuff up. She claimed that she was raped when she was going through puberty. No evidence, none whatsoever. She said the guy broke in her house and raped her. She was a latchkey kid. And the door wasn't broken in. They did a rape kit on her and they didn't find anything. But she still claims to this day that she was, as odd as that is. And anytime she was looking for attention, guess who showed up? She saw the face of her rapist and began to cry. And that was just the silliest thing to do. Anyway, that's my niece. Write that down. She's my niece. I don't claim her as a blood relative, however. She's my brother's kid. But her mother's nutty as a fruitcake too. I won't tell you how nutty she is. All right. So it must be the mother. It's not my brother that caused the gene. My family's normal. Okay, so the signs must be there for 6 months. For much of that time, except for 1 month, when they are in their psychotic episode, the symptoms can be either residual, where they're attenuated symptoms. Attenuated means thin, or you can't see them very well. Attenuated symptoms that follow an active phase, or prodromal. It looks like they're about to have a psychotic episode. That's what prodromal means. It's the way that they act before they have a psychotic episode. So if you can see this for 6 months, for an extended length of time. Although most cases have onset between the late teens to the mid-30s, schizophrenia can be diagnosed at any age. The earlier it is diagnosed, the worse the prognosis. So if you have a 5-year-old that is diagnosed with schizophrenia, that person is going to have a very tough time for the rest of their lives. If you have an individual that is 30, they've been normal for 30 years. Now all of a sudden they have a psychotic episode. Their prognosis is going to be much, much better. Potentially they will have normal times. If you have a 5-year-old, they're going to have trouble all the time for the rest of their lives. And some of the times will be worse than others. Those will be the psychotic episodes. But even when they're not in a psychotic episode, it looks like they're leading into another one. So they will have a very difficult time. Rates for comorbid substance-related disorders, especially nicotine dependence, are quite high, and this is what I was talking about. Why nicotine? Because of the dopamine, raises your dopamine level, and it makes them feel normal. So it is a means of self-medication, and you should not take the cigarettes away from it, because then you're more likely to have a psychotic episode. So these individuals need to continue smoking. The risk of suicide is also elevated. Up to 20% will make at least one suicide attempt. This is somebody suffering from schizophrenia. Between 5 and 6% will succeed. It isn't the deadliest mental illness. The deadliest mental illness is anorexia. They starve themselves to death at a higher level. But these individuals will succeed in committing suicide at about 5 to 6%. It's slightly more common among males, but then again, males have more severe symptoms than females do. Most evidence puts the prevalence rate at about 1% of the population. This is worldwide. In the United States, our estimates are somewhere between 0.3% and 0.7%, but as I explained to you before, we misdiagnose it a lot. If you had a child that was schizophrenic, would you want your child to be diagnosed as schizophrenic? And the answer is no. It's just like my sister-in-law. She didn't want her daughter to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. This is a mental illness. This is a black mark on her family. It's a black mark on my family. I don't actually consider it a black mark on my family, but because I consider the child her mother's child, not my brother's child. Anyway, so getting her to admit that this child had schizophrenia, it took them about 15 years to get her diagnosed with schizophrenia. This individual has never been able to hold down a job. She was working, she started in college, she had straight A's in high school, she was a concert trumpeter. She played the trumpet, and she played in a symphony orchestra. She was amazing. Everything she tried, she excelled. She excelled at just about everything. Anyway, so she went to college, and of course she had straight A's in high school. She had a full ride to Ball State University. She started school, and the first semester she had to drop out. Well, it's the second semester she had to drop out. The excuse she gave for dropping out was because she was pregnant. She couldn't handle the coursework. The reality is she was flunking everything. She was studying oceanography in the middle of Indiana. That's the place. How much farther away from the ocean can you get in Indiana? I know. That's how smart this kid is. She was studying oceanography in Indiana, okay? Oh, man. Anyway. So she's never held down a job. She got a job working at a apartment complex. All she had to do was mow the lawn. She never mowed it. Never mowed the lawn. Couldn't handle it. Stress was too great for her. Mowing the lawn. You know how hard it is to mow the lawn. You have to start it. You have to put the oil in. You have to put the gasoline in. My God, so much stress. And then you have to push it. Oh. She never did it once. She's never had a job that she did. She's 50, wait a minute. She's the same age as my son. My son's 46. She's 46. She's never had a job in her whole life. But she's produced babies. She had one kid. And guess what happened to that kid? She's schizophrenic too. I know, what a shock. Anyway, interesting stuff. Risk of suicide is slightly more common among males. Okay, we're done. Earlier versions of the DSM classified schizophrenia by its subtype. This is the old days. This is just historical. Don't look at any of these. Don't memorize any of them. We used to have paranoid schizophrenia, disorganized schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia, undifferentiated schizophrenia, residual schizophrenia, and hebephrenic schizophrenia. That was my favorite. It's always my favorite because this is something that teenagers suffered from. Hebephrenia means that you draw gory pictures. And these individuals, they would draw pictures of severed heads and, frogs with their legs pulled off and bleeding. And really kind of weird stuff. But they were hebephrenic. And we still see this, of course. We still have people that are fixated on gory things. And these guys are kind of dangerous. They can be potentially dangerous because sometimes they will try to live out their fantasies. These tend to be their fantasies. But of course we don't call it hebephrenia anymore like we used to. This was discontinued, of course, with the DSM-5. If you read the DSM-4, then you saw paranoid schizophrenia, disorganized schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia, and undifferentiated schizophrenia. So there are 4 different types. We don't do that anymore. DSM-5 has done away with that. Now we use process schizophrenia. Process schizophrenia is early and gradual onset of symptoms and a poor prognosis for recovery. So process schizophrenia would be an individual that at a relatively young age, maybe as a teenager, this individual started having schizophrenic symptoms. Slowly they got worse and worse and worse and worse. The reality is with schizophrenia, you don't ever get better. So if you lose something, if you start having hallucinations, you'll never lose those hallucinations. You always have hallucinations. You have delusions, it's the same way. If you lose your ability to speak, you will never speak again. It only gets worse, it never gets better. And I'll show you one of the reasons why. It actually restructures your brain. And once your brain is restructured, you can't restructure it. You can't change it back to the way it was. So that's process schizophrenia. This is the one with the worst prognosis. Process schizophrenia. Reactive schizophrenia is relatively normal social and intellectual development of the individual, so they seem like everything's fine, and all of a sudden something happens to them. Something happens, like they have a brain injury, or they get sick, they get a really high fever, and all of a sudden they start suffering from schizophrenia. And this is known as reactive schizophrenia. These individuals will not get any better also, but their symptoms are not as bad. And for that reason, of course, they have a better prognosis. And actually, there is a possibility that they can recover with medication. These individuals can recover with medication. Process schizophrenia, no way. It's a death sentence as far as they're concerned, unfortunately. Type 1 is positive symptoms predominate. Type 1 symptoms have to do with hallucinations and delusions. So these individuals will have several of these problems. And of course, once they get them, they never lose them. Type 2, they have negative symptoms. They have a flat effect where they don't show any emotion. Abolition means they don't want to work. They don't want to do anything. So they just kind of sit at home and watch television. Alogia, they don't speak, or they don't speak a lot. And they tend to be socially withdrawn. Outcome measures are more positive for type 1 schizophrenia. If they can get rid of these delusions, if we can stop these delusions and hallucinations, then potentially we can make them have fewer and fewer psychotic episodes. Once you lose it, you never get it back. Once this takes place, you never get any better. If you lose your words, they're gone forever. If you're socially withdrawn, you'll never become the life of the party. If you sit in front of the television, and that's of course what catatonia is, you can't move, and you won't move for the rest of your life, as ugly as that is. Low premorbid adjustment characteristics. If the individual was never married, if they never worked at one job for more than 2 years, if they had no academic or vocational training after high school. In other words, they didn't do anything after high school. They had no steady dating as a teenager, and they were never deeply in love. The probability of these individuals having a negative outcome is very high. If they have never led a normal life, if they have never lived in society, and that's kind of my niece is an individual that in high school she was okay, but she could never handle it. She couldn't handle anything after high school. And of course her prognosis is fairly poor. She didn't date as a teenager. She found a boy that wanted to have sex with her, but that's not dating. And eventually they had a child, but that was it. Did she love the guy? Well, no. He was somebody she could control, and that's why she was with him. Poor premorbid patients are more deviant in language and thought processes, and possibly a stronger genetic disposition than good premorbid patients. So if you have an individual that was able to get married, they have some college behind them, they were fairly normal in high school. Individuals that weren't normal in high school, these individuals will continue to have problems for the rest of their lives. But an individual is relatively normal in high school, then the prognosis is much, much better. But if they were not functioning very well in high school, then now we got a problem. If they don't develop their schizophrenia until they're in the 30s, then their prognosis is much, much better. All we need to do is medicate them, and potentially they'll come out of it. Rapid or acute onset of positive and florid symptoms occurring later in life in someone with good premorbid adjustment is associated with better prognosis for recovery than that. And that's just what I was just saying. So if it's later in life that they develop their schizophrenia, then the prognosis is much, much better. You can't get used to your glasses. How are you with your glasses?
Oh, it's okay.
Okay. All right, as long as you're okay. Schizophreniform disorder, the other diagnosis besides schizophrenia, schizophreniform disorder, schizoaffective disorder, brief psychotic disorder, delusional disorder, and other specified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. These are all the other psychotic disorders we're going to talk about. Shared psychotic disorders, psychotic disorder due to a general medical condition. These are specifiers. Substance medication-induced psychotic disorder, individuals that take crystal meth or amphetamines or snort cocaine, potentially they will have a psychotic episode while they are under the influence of whatever their medication is. If we look at how amphetamines work, then amphetamines actually kick you into a psychosis, and that makes you feel high, that makes you feel good, it makes you feel on top of the world. But unfortunately, that is a form of psychosis. I think I told you this story. Some of you know this story. I had a student back in Fort Belknap. She was a meth head. And she used to use meth from time to time, not very often, but at any time she used meth. And you know, the strange thing about methamphetamines, it makes you stupid. It makes you not be able to concentrate. Okay, it doesn't make you very smart. It takes about 18 months for your brain to recover. She was really smart. She's really smart lady. But every time a crisis occurred in her life, and she had to go down to Great Falls, which was about, 150 miles away. If she had to go to Great Falls, that's where she used crystal meth. So every time she went to Great Falls for something, somebody got sick, and they sent them to Great Falls, and she had to go to Great Falls to be with her dad or be with her whatever. Then she would have a relapse, and she would use crystal meth, and then she'd have a relapse. Her father was in a farming accident. He was in a what is it? The hay. It's it wasn't a baler. It was a windrow. Windrow. Yeah, it makes the roads. He was cleaning out underneath, and the damn thing came down. Poked holes all over his body, as you can imagine. It looked like he was dead, that kind of thing. Took him to, he's okay. He's dead now, but he was okay then. They took him to the hospital. He's got all these holes all over his body. And of course, the prognosis isn't very good. Oh my God, he's 90 years old, and he just had this windrow drop on his body. He's probably going to die, that kind of stuff. So she runs down to Great Falls, and what happens next? Well, every time she goes, all she has to do is drive on this one street, and she uses. She finds them, and she knows who they are, too. She knows where to find these guys, and she finds somebody, and she uses her crystal meth. And her dad's in the hospital. Her dad's in the hospital, and mom's dead. That's not right. Her mom's still alive. All of a sudden, she starts speaking Spanish. She starts speaking Spanish, and she steals somebody's check. This is her problem. Was she would when she was using, she'd write bad checks. So she stole somebody's check, and she endorsed it and everything. And she tried to cash the thing, and they caught her. And the police came to pick her up, and she said, "Oh, I'm glad you're here." She's speaking it with a Mexican accent. "Oh, I'm glad you're here. My father has murdered my mother. And he's buried her out in the backyard. I'm so glad that you're here." And she started speaking Spanish to them, And of course, it wasn't real Spanish because she couldn't speak Spanish. She was making it all up. But she was having a psychotic episode. She thought she was this lady. So she tells the cops that her dad has murdered her mother and buried her in the backyard. And she tells them it's at 615 Maple Drive. And so they go to 615 Maple Drive. They dig up the backyard. Of course, there's nothing in the backyard except dead dogs. Well, one or two dead dogs. They don't find. They got real excited when they found the bones. As you can imagine, turns out to be a German Shepherd. Anyway, so they're digging up the backyard, and they find these bones, and they determine as soon as they find the skull, they know that it's not a human. And of course, she's at the police department going, oh, my poor mother, my poor blessed mother, that kind of stuff. And so they come back and they said, there's nothing in the backyard. And she said, oh, no, it's the house next door. It's the house next door. You've gone to the wrong house. So they go next door and they dig up the thing. There's no bones in that backyard. But about that time, her crystal meth is wearing off. And so her psychotic episode stops. And all of a sudden, she stops speaking with a Mexican accent. And as it turns out, of course, there was no dead body in the backyard. Her dad's still alive. Her mom's still alive. And she's just had a psychotic episode from the crystal meth. And they arrested her and they put her in jail for a couple of weeks. I didn't see her for a couple of weeks. Then she finally comes back to school. Write this down. She finally comes back to school. She finally comes back to school, and I told her, look, you've had a psychotic episode. If you use crystal meth again, you may not come back. You may always be Esmeralda, whatever. I know. It was so funny. I mean, it wasn't funny. I mean, it was kind of funny the way she told it. She couldn't even speak with a Spanish accent. But down there, they thought she was Mexican. She was a Mexican immigrant. Wonder what the hell's she doing in Great Falls, Montana. Anyway, eventually, and she stopped using after that. Her dad got better. Eventually, her dad died. And guess what? She went down for the funeral. It was in Great Falls. I know. Then she wrote a bad check. They put her in jail again. She was in jail for a year and a half. I'm not exactly sure what happened. Anyway, okay. So, all kinds of interesting things can happen to you. Substance medication-induced psychotic disorder, very, very real. Opiates can kick you into psychosis. Marijuana can kick you into psychosis. Obviously, any speed, amphetamines, crystal meth, any of those things can kick you into psychosis. Schizophreniform disorder involves symptoms that are identical to those. What time is it? 3:49?
Yeah.
4:20, right? Okay, thanks, Chris. You're a pal. You could have told me like 3:50, right? I know. Oh, man. Okay, schizophreniform disorder involves symptoms that are identical to those of schizophrenia's criterion A. And, of course, the criterion A had to do with delusions and hallucinations, including hallucinations and delusions, disorganized speech and behavior, and negative psychotic symptoms. So why isn't it schizophrenia? Because it lasts for less than a month. The diagnosis of schizophreniform disorder is given only if the duration of the symptom is at least a month, but less than 6 months, so they don't look like they're as psychotic as the individual suffering from schizophrenia. 2/3 of those with schizophreniform disorder will likely develop either schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. What will happen at this stage is they assume that they're in the pre-prodromal stage. In other words, they are building up to a psychotic episode. That's what they assume this individual is suffering from. Schizoaffective disorder combines psychosis and mood disorder symptoms. Symptoms must be present for 2 weeks or more with major mood symptom absent. Mood symptoms must be present a majority of the time. Coded according to its mood symptoms, either bipolar type or depressive type. We don't have an agitated type or an anxiety type. It's always a depressed type, and that's the mood that we're talking about. No manic episodes. Females are more likely to receive a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, largely because females tend to show more frequent mood disorders. Okay, we don't like to identify somebody as having schizophrenia, because then we have to give them antipsychotics. We have to give them really strong medications. These are very strong medications. And for that reason, we try not to give them this diagnosis. So what we will do is give them a diagnosis that is less than that. If they are showing depression with their symptoms, then probably we will give them we will diagnose them with schizoaffective disorder. And this is where the arguments come in. Remember, there are no two psychologists that will agree on anything at all. So if Edison and I are diagnosing somebody, if I'm the jerk that day, I'm going to diagnose this person with schizophrenia, and Edison's going to go, no, it's not that severe. She's got depression. She's got schizoaffective disorder. And this is the way it works. This is one of the reasons why when somebody has done something bad, like the guy that shut up the theater in Aurora, Colorado, and they had psychologists talking to this individual. 35 psychologists saw him, and 20 of them diagnosed him with schizophrenia. Well, they all saw exactly the same thing, but 15 of them diagnosed him as not having schizophrenia, as being able to stand trial. The 20 of them said one thing, and 15 said something else. And the something else was probably schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenic disorder. So this is really kind of tough. There are no absolutes. There's no matrix that we can use that will say, this is absolutely schizophrenia. That's one of the reasons why every time my niece went to a new psychologist, they diagnosed her with something different. And usually it was the less severe problem. They didn't want to diagnose her with schizophrenia because they didn't want to give her the medication. This medication, and if I give you a diagnosis of schizophrenia, that's almost a life sentence. Can be a life, probably will be a life sentence for somebody that's only 19 years old. And we have to start medicating them with the antipsychotic medication, which is very strong. And one of the things that the medication did, it made all of her teeth fall out. That ain't pretty. It also weakened her tendons. So since she had to do her laundry downstairs, and she had to walk downstairs in order to put the clothes in the washer and dryer, she blew both of her knees out. She's had to have both of her knees replaced. As strange and ugly as that can seem to be. So that's one of the reasons why we don't like to give them the more severe diagnosis. And that's why Edison's diagnosis will probably be the one that is taken, because he's going to give them a lesser diagnosis. And it's very logical. It's very logical. Does all this make sense? Okay. So you got to understand, I'm telling you what this stuff is, but if Sarah was in this room and we were diagnosing somebody, the probability of us diagnosing the two people the same would be fairly remote. I tend to be, I try to be a nice guy. I try to be a nice guy. It doesn't happen every time. But I do that with my students too. If I'm grading you, if I grade you and Sarah grades you, she's going to grade your paper tougher than I am, probably. I'll read the same paper, we'll make the same corrections, and I'll give you a 92, and she'll give you an 84. And it's just because of the way that we think, okay? And psychologists are exactly the same way. Soft-hearted and soft-headed. And you can take that one to the bank. Anyway, and I'm not saying that she's wrong. What I'm saying is, we both are right, but there are no absolutes, and there's just nothing we can do about it. So just like Edison and I don't agree, Sarah and I don't agree. That's why we argue all the time. We love each other, but we argue all the time. So that's just the way it works. That's just the way it works. Sorry. Anyway, okay. The prevalence of schizoaffective disorder is about 1/3 that of schizophrenia. Difficulty involves reliability distinguishing schizoaffective disorder from schizophrenia, just like what I was just saying, in which there may be mood symptoms, and if there are mood symptoms, do we call them schizoaffective disorder? No, we can have schizophrenia with mood disorders as well. Mood disorder with psychotic features, which may include hallucinations and delusions. So potentially, in order to stay away from the diagnosis of schizophrenia, we could, Edison could say that she has mood disorder with psychotic features. And the reality is that severe depression has psychotic features to it. So is she depressed with psychotic features, or does she have psychosis with mood disorder. Mood disorder with psychotic features. I mean, that's the question you have to ask yourself. So which one is right? Well, both are right. It all depends on the severity of how you're reading what's happening. Misdiagnosis is common. Oh, I hate to tell you that. No, we're right every damn time. No, misdiagnosis is very, very common. And this is the reason that they looked at that guy in Aurora, and 15 of them said he didn't have schizophrenia, and 20 of them did. So they have put him in a mental hospital. How many people did he kill? 28? He wounded 70. I know, he just shot up the whole theater, killing people. DSM-5 suggests that schizoaffective disorder is not a distinct nosological category. It's how we categorize the disease. Age of onset is usually young adulthood, and prognosis tends to be better than that of schizophrenia, but worse than that of mood disorder. So if we diagnose them with depression, if we diagnose them with severe depression, now we can treat them with antidepressants. Okay. But if they actually have schizoaffective disorder, we'll probably treat them with antipsychotics.
Are they born with it?
No,
It's
it just develops.
Such as the environment in the home?
It can be, yeah. The more negative the environment, the more likely that they will show the symptoms younger. Okay. Sometimes they can use a drug that will kick them into psychosis, including marijuana. It's a hallucinogen, and it can kick somebody into psychosis.
Is there any cases of peyote?
No. No. Even if there were, we wouldn't have been. No. No, peyote's, it is a hallucinogen, but it's probably the least severe hallucinogen that is out there. So we have no cases. It's the least addictive substance that people use. So marijuana is, on the other hand, it can kick people into psychosis. Yeah, but not peyote. Okay. Probably. If you know the case.
Like someone that abuses it?
Peyote's kind of hard to abuse. It's kind of hard to find, and it makes you kind of sick when you use it. So the probability, I don't know. If you know anybody that uses it, I would find that really fascinating. You need to write them up as a case study and just follow them around, watch what they're doing. That would be fascinating. Because we have no information. And one of the reasons we don't even look at it anymore is because it's a religious substance. It's accepted as Native American church. It's a religious ritual that is used. So we're not even looking at it. You can't get it in prisons. The reason we look at nutmeg is because that's what they use, and it can cause hallucinations. So also causes nutmeg, yeah. Yeah, if you use enough of it. And there you go. Exactly. More. Dude, come on.
Give me the one they sell at the store, like in the powder?
Yeah.
The brown stuff?
Yeah, brown stuff. I know. Eggnog, there we go.
Eggnog.
I know. I know. Try it sometime. No, just kidding. You would have to use a lot, okay? But in prisons, they know this, so they do it. And of course, it makes them sick.
Is peyote allowed in prison? Like
Only for the Native American church. So for them to abuse it, well, it wouldn't. They don't get enough to abuse it. Not that I'm aware of. But we don't have any cases of that. I have never read any research that said that. So.
I'm not going against it, but I'm just like wondering. There's.
Yeah, it's not a very strong hallucinogen. It's fairly weak. It's weaker than marijuana. Yeah. And we do see it with marijuana. We'll talk about it in a minute. Brief psychotic disorder involves sudden onset of psychotic symptoms that last more than 1 day, but not more than a month, with eventual return to full functioning. And we do see this. People will have a psychotic episode that just lasts for 24 hours, or it lasts for 36 hours. You know, they're having a nervous breakdown, you know, that kind of thing. Psychotic indications involve at least one positive symptom, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, or disorganized or catatonic behavior. Catatonic behavior is just them sitting there without talking, without moving. That's catatonic behavior. Maybe you do that when you have a really bad day. You just go home and sit in a chair and kind of stare out into space. That's catatonia. Okay. Especially if you can't move. I had one of these episodes a couple days ago. You guys have bugged me so much. No, I'm just kidding. I got home. No, I love teaching, and I have no problems with anything. You guys can turn in your papers late. I don't care. It doesn't make any difference to me. But the administration just drives me back. I don't know how Don does it. He's my hero. Don puts up with all this crap that they dump on him, and I don't know how he does it, because the administration just drives me nuts. And I got home at night, and I just sat in my car. Luckily, I turned it off. So I just sat in my car. I'm staring out, and Ed, you know Ed, next door neighbor, came over. He knocked on the door and said, "Are you okay?" And that kind of woke me up. I guess. Ed, you know.
Did you scare you?
Ed, no. He's so skinny. How could he scare me? Nobody knocked on the door. He was scared. The strange part was, so I'm not moving. Yeah, I know. So I'm not moving, and I'm just looking straight out, and he comes from the side that I saw him. You know, it's like I'm looking at him, except I'm looking this way, and I'm seeing him through my peripheral vision. You know, he always wears the same coat. He had that blue coat with white stripe on it. I knew it was him. Okay. Ed's a funny guy.
Do we just is that like a type of relaxation?
Yeah, I was trying to decompress. Yeah, they just given me like 3 things that I needed to do by, yesterday. So, yeah. I don't know how Don does it. He's amazing. Yes, I know how he does it. He meditates. That's how he does it. He meditates. It keeps him from going crazy. Psychotic indications involve at least one positive symptom, and I think we've already talked about it. No, we didn't. One positive symptom, delusion, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and they are not explained by effects of drugs, medical conditions, or other mental disorders that can cause transient psychosis. In other words, a nervous breakdown. Brief psychotic disorder can be specified with marked stressors, without marked stressors, or with postpartum onset. If condition began within 4 weeks after birth, of course, we call it postpartum onset. In England, if you kill your baby, if you execute your baby within 18 months after the birth of the baby, it's not considered a crime. It's not considered infanticide, because they assume that you're in postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. I've seen postpartum psychosis a couple times. Sometimes an individual will give birth to a baby and she won't want to have anything to do with it. And sometimes she won't come out of it. We had a case when I was working in Omaha. One of the guys that was working for me, he was a Mormon, and they were just so giddy about the fact that they were going to have a baby. This is their first baby. And he was working for me. I met the wife a couple times, and the deeper she got into the pregnancy, the bigger she got. And she always complained about the fact that she was so fat. I'm so fat. I just hate this baby because I'm so fat. And she started out, as soon as she started getting larger, she started complaining about the baby, about how much she hated the baby. And of course, as a psychologist, I'm listening to this and going, this ain't right. There's something going on here. Of course, he was going, oh, no, you love the baby, we're going to have a great time, one of those kind of deals. So finally, she gives birth to the baby in our hospital. I was working at St. Joseph at the time. She gave birth in our hospital, and the first time they gave her the baby, she let the baby roll off the bed. I know. She let the baby roll off the bed. This was right after the baby was born. And they gave her the baby again, and this time they watched her. This was like the next day, when she was supposed to be breastfeeding, but she wouldn't expose her breasts. So she was holding the baby, and the nurse was aware that the baby had fallen the day before. So they were watching her really close, and she let it go. She tried to drop it again, but the nurse caught it this time and couldn't let it fall. They left, he left about 6 months later. She was never able to see the baby for those 6 months. Her mother lived in Omaha. He was from Idaho. He moved back to Idaho and moved in with his family, with the baby, of course. And the mother went and lived with the mother because she didn't want to, and if the baby's name came up, the woman would not respond. I mean, the name was like poison to her. So she had a psychotic episode. And of course they separated. She couldn't see the baby anymore. He came back about 3 or 4 months later to see his wife, and he didn't bring the baby, of course. And I talked to her about it. She said she's had a complete psychotic breakdown, and just from postpartum psychosis. And we see postpartum depression all the time. This is fairly common. Your progesterone level goes down. While you're pregnant, you're rosy cheeked and you're so happy about everything, and then all of a sudden you have the baby and your hormones change, and so you get a little bit depressed. You can get depressed, and that's postpartum depression.
Did that lady get out of it?
Relatively common. And so,
Did she get out of it though?
no. My mother knew of a case. My mother, as I said, my mother was a registered nurse, and she worked at nurseries. They had another case that was very, very similar to that. And this lady never did recover. Never recovered. She never recovered. And they finally let her out of the hospital, even though she was still psychotic, and she became a prostitute. And she did some really strange things. She would try to seduce the mayor, that kind of thing. And sometimes she was successful. And then she'd go to the newspaper and she'd write up this news story about how all the things that the mayor did to her and all that stuff. I know. I was excited as well. Anyway, so she never recovered from her postpartum psychosis. Postpartum psychosis is very rare. Postpartum depression, very common, relatively common. The numbers, the figures, of course, we don't know exactly, but sometimes they say, 50%, 80% of women suffer from postpartum depression, which is relatively normal. But of course, they usually don't try to kill their baby. It's the psychotic ones that try to kill their babies.
So what do they do if they do have that postpartum depression? Is there treatment to help them get out of it?
That's an excellent question. What do we do with this lady? I had a case in Mississippi. I was working on an Air Force base. I was teaching general psychology. And I had a student that was pregnant, a little tiny thing. She was weird because I couldn't hear her. I've got a hearing loss at a certain level, and she would hide behind people and say horrible things about her. So I couldn't see her, I couldn't hear her. And the class is just bursting out laughing because she's just calling me all kinds of a son of a bitch. So it was really kind of interesting. But she was pregnant, and this was while she was pregnant, because she was doing all this stuff. She finally gave birth, and one day she wrote a poem about killing her baby. And she left it on the seat of the chair. Well, I knew who it was because she's always sat in that chair. And I read the poem, and I gave it to I went to the clinic and showed them the letter, and I told them what it was. And they treated her, and what they treated her with was Zoloft, which is a really strong SSRI. But it seemed to bring her out of it. She still flunked the class, because she said all those nasty things. No, I'm just kidding. She didn't finish the class because she had the baby and she was out for a while. She never came back. They gave her Zoloft. So you can give her an SSRI. You can give people an SSRI. Of all the three, there's Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil. Of the three, Zoloft is probably the strongest. It also has less of an effect. Prozac will get into the mother's milk, but Zoloft doesn't. So that's the other reason that they were using it. She had a little boy baby. She hated boys. She hated men. At that point, she hated men. It's really kind of a horrible, nasty poem, as you can imagine, but it was a poem about killing her son.
I think the kind of case for deliveries. It's lower on the reservation, not the reservation, because they have a ceremony before birth.
Oh, okay. Well, that will take care of things. And also, you've got somebody, you've got aunties and parents and grandparents
Support.
to give support, exactly. And that's what I did with my daughter. I made sure that there was somebody with her to help her after she had the baby, because
Even through labor.
right,
Labor.
yeah. And we were all there with her. I was there for the first 6 weeks after the baby was born, and then my wife went down to stay with my wife. And I thought that was a really good idea. Trying to take care of a newborn baby by yourself, but that's what white people do. You have a husband, so that's what white people do. They just kind of leave them to take care of themselves. It's really not very nice. I think it's much better if you have
That's the
support.
reason why I tell my daughters, that when they're pregnant, I just tell them that their friends or boyfriends can leave anytime with their
Right.
husbands.
Sure.
I said, let them go. Think about your pregnancy. And be without about your pregnancy. Which is normal.
Yeah, I admire that. I think it's much better to have support. And the more support you have, the better off you are. In the old days, aunts, maiden aunts would come and stay with you. But now, if you're white, you don't have any support whatsoever. Mom's out partying somewhere. Grandma's. Well, see, Doris is nodding her head. This is true. I hate to pick on a race, okay, but white people are kind of. I know. We all have friends who are white. Something's wrong with those people. Up to 9% of the cases of first onset psychosis may be accounted for by brief psychotic disorder, and this is what we see. They will have a psychotic episode. It won't last for very long, and then they just continue to have these episodes, and they get longer and longer and longer. Brief psychotic disorder is twice as common among females as it is among males. And you can call this nervous breakdown if you want to. Women tend to be moodier than males are. You have that change of mood during your menstrual period. And because of that, women tend to have more of these than men do. Okay, we're going to talk about premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder. We used to call it premenstrual syndrome, where the change of mood is extreme. It's quite extreme. The prognosis tends to be much better than for other psychotic conditions. This brief psychotic disorder. Delusional disorder involves a more limited range of psychotic symptoms. Delusions may be bizarre, but do not include prominent auditory or visual hallucinations. Delusions are persistent, at least 1 month in duration, and they're focused on a theme apart from which there may be little impairment in behavior or functioning. Diagnosis is subtyped according to the predominant theme of the delusion. Erotomanic, in other words, you're in love with somebody who doesn't know who you are. Grandiosity, this is the individual that has the Jesus complex, or they think there's somebody else. They think they're Donald Trump and they've got $7 billion. Jealous, these individuals are sure that their significant other is messing around on them despite the fact they have no proof whatsoever. What, didn't they make a song like that where the lady just ripped the guy's truck apart, busted out his headlights? Right? She slashed all of his tires? Yeah, Carrie Underwood. What proof does she have? Did she see them together? No, this was all a fantasy. It's right there in the song.
So it leads to what we call sexual harassment, or no, what is it called? Abuse?
Sexual abuse?
Yeah,
I
or
don't
not
think
sexual
she was in abuse.
Assault, yes.
Assault, she assaulted his car. She destroyed his car. Did she know that there was a lady? She imagined that he was sneaking around behind her and helping her with her pull shot. Remember? In the song, you never heard the song? Oh, it's
I've
fun.
heard the song. But
It's fun. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, so she may be suffering from jealous delusional disorder. Okay. Persecutory, in other words, you think somebody is persecuting you. Somatic, you've got body problems, or you feel like there's something wrong in your body. You can have all of these mixed together if you want, and that's mixed, or unspecified. You have delusional disorder. As much fun as all that is. Other specifiers include with bizarre content. If the delusions are clearly implausible, if you think that there are aliens that have landed on your lawn, that's a delusion, potentially. I'm assuming there's no aliens landing on your lawn. Much of the delusional thinking and behavior is logical if one accepts a basic premise. For example, a conspiracy. So we see these conspiracies all the time. We see them on television. What is one of my favorites? Hillary Clinton's Satan. Isn't she? Is she? Remember the conspiracy where they thought that the Clintons were, what were they doing? Sex trafficking children out of a pizza parlor in New York City. Remember that conspiracy theory? That came out during the election. I know, it came out during the election. People go, oh my God. And this one guy took a gun and he went to that pizza parlor and he was going to break in there and free those children because it was sex trafficking of children. It didn't happen. It was all a conspiracy theory, but that's part of this whole delusional thing. It can be part of this delusional thing. The people that actually believed that that was happening potentially were suffering from delusional disorder. They really were sex trafficking out of that pizza parlor. The other problem was it destroyed that pizza parlor's business. It destroyed their business. This conspiracy theory that they as much fun as that. So we can make up anything that we want. What's another story that they told about Hillary Clinton? Hillary and Bill were flying to Thailand to have sex with children, and they had taken this trip for like 15 times. Write that down. Hillary and Bill. I can't think of any more conspiracy theories. I don't really listen to them. I laugh at them, but I don't really listen to them. I don't believe them. But when the guy pulled the gun and tried to break into that pizza parlor to free all those children, that was a bit much. So he was taking it a little bit too far. Delusional disorder appears to be uncommon with population incidence as low as 0.2%. Delusional disorder seems to occur at equal rates in males and females, although males may be more likely to show the jealous subtype. In other words, they're just sure that their old lady is messing around with somebody else. Far more common with men than women. Diagnoses are rare in part because such individuals do not seek help. They have delusions, okay? They have these ideas. So they think these ideas are true. So why in the world would they ever go to a psychologist to ask them, is Hillary and Bill, are they really sex trafficking children out of this pizza parlor? They're never going to say that. So they just print it on the internet, pretending that it's true. So why would men be more jealous than women? Any ideas?
Dominance. To control.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense. That's very logical. So if a man thinks that a woman is messing around on him, then she's going to reproduce with somebody else. Right? Yeah, so if a man... Okay, they did this study where they looked at women shooting... women's husbands messing around on women and men messing around on women. And what they discovered was, if a man catches his wife in bed with another man, who does he shoot? He doesn't shoot his wife. Of course he's not going to shoot his wife. He shoots the guy. If a woman catches a man in bed with another woman, who does she shoot? She shoots her husband. No, they discovered this. It's fascinating, isn't it? So the jealousy structure of males and the jealousy structure of females is completely different. Because a woman represents children, but a man only represents sperm. So it takes 9 months to make a baby if you're a woman, but a man can reproduce every day, right? So who does the man shoot? He shoots the other man. Does the woman shoot? The woman shoots
The man.
the man. She shoots her husband. She can find another sperm donor anyway.
She kills both of them.
No, they don't.
Before we already have a sperm donor.
They don't kill them both. They only kill one of them. That's the way it works. Okay, we'll see you guys next time. Next week.